So what is the interest of this supposed to be? Just like us talking about like dragons? We could be like maybe do like dragon speak, like uwu, dwagon.
Is is that dragon speak? I thought that was something else.
I don't know. It could be though. Anyways, recording's
Okay.
live. We're already going. All right. So basically today we're talking about Augmentation Evoker. Um, so they released the new. We took 2 weeks off. They released the new spec on 10.1.5. We're like, surely this thing won't be that broken. We come back, and the spec is just as overtuned as we kind of initially anticipated. It's actually it's a super cool spec. I will say that whenever they were decided to design like something like a support spec, I think that this is a really cool way of tackling it. But it has changed the metagame significantly. I think that there's also a couple of different things about augmentation specifically that we wanted to talk about and kind of weigh in on, whether it be the good things about augmentation, the bad things about augmentation, kind of like what is the future of the spec, what should it look like?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting thing because obviously, like the fact that it's launched in such a lopsided balance thing is gonna obscure a lot of the nuance to like how fun it will be to have a spec like this in the game, particularly the Mythic Plus side of things.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I think the sentiment around augmentation would definitely be different if it wasn't as incredibly valuable and like guaranteed group spot as it is right now in among groups that are smart enough to know that it's actually doing better than the 20k it looks like it's doing on details, right? Which has also been an interesting challenge with the new spec. There's been a lot of screenshots of Augmentation Evokers getting kicked for doing low DPS, which is a different topic that I don't think we need to talk too much about in this one. But
so
I don't know. I mean, I think adding a supportive style spec to the game is pretty cool because it opens up WoW to a new type of player, to people that haven't really had I mean, there's a lot of people that this is going to be exactly what they were looking for and what they're going to have the most fun playing.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a style of spec that honestly, if I had the ability to be able to design a style of spec that I was playing, I think it would be something similar to augmentation, where it is like I'm buffing up my friends, I'm helping them be successful. But I think the level of contribution that is attributed to the Augmentation Evoker is maybe a bit high right now. It is a quite potent spec, to the point where whenever we had to update our tier lists for 10.1.5, which they are updated, we slammed augmentation immediately in S for Mythic Plus, and I think we ended up putting it in A for raid for DPS, and it's like, it's good. Like it's a really good specialization in both raid and Mythic Plus, and it is tuned quite high.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is like right now the way that it's tuned in M Plus is it is a mandatory spec. If the spec were to get nerfed to a point where that wasn't true, would it still be like a fun and enjoyable spec to be around? Because the problem with the augmentation is it is bringing so much utility to the group, and it synergizes so well with certain good specs that are being played using their cooldowns properly. If you nerf the spec, like, do you need to nerf it to a point where it's actually, like in most groups, actually bringing pretty bad damage to still be balanced with the amount of utility and with the ceiling, with the potential in a group that is using it to its fullest? And if they do that, is the spec still going to be fun? Or should they just accept that we've moved from a 3 DPS world to a 2 DPS and 1 support world? And should they make more support specs as a result? Because that might be the healthiest way to actually resolve this, especially for M+.
I think it as it currently stands with the current landscape of WoW, I think that moving into a world where we have 2 DPS and 1 support doesn't necessarily make sense, but that's mostly because there's only 1 support specialization currently in the game. If maybe they had slammed this on an expansion launch and they reworked a bunch of specs coming into the expansion, and a decent amount of them got converted into support specs, say, 35% of the DPS specializations or 30% of the DPS specializations got completely reworked. I'm just saying hypothetically here.
Yeah. It's tough because, like, there are not 35% of specs that would be at all happy with being converted to a support spec, is the thing, right? Like, as much as there are people that want to play support in WoW, for every spec, most people playing that spec do not want to see it changed to a support spec.
I think, okay, so let's talk about their dominance in Mythic Plus. So when Augmentation came out, it came out with a couple of other changes as well. So Guardian Druid got some talent reshuffling. Holy Paladin got some talent changes as well. Fire, or just Mage in general, got a pretty significant rework on the tree, and then Augmentation came out. All of these specs are present now in the high-end Mythic Plus metagame, where you see we can scroll for pages upon pages, and the comp is Guardian Druid, Holy Paladin, Fire Mage, Shadow Priest, Augmentation Evoker, and occasionally you see something that's a bit different, like you see a Prot Warrior here, you see a Vengeance Demon Hunter here, sometimes you see, no Mage, sometimes you see no Priest, but that's also unlikely. We watched the TGP today, and there was a similar compositional thing. So Augmentation on release has been very hot in terms of what it provides from a Mythic Plus situation. A lot of this has to do with not only their damage contribution, but also their survivability increases that they allow and they give to players.
Yes, that's the thing, right? Is like it is bringing effectively the best damage or very good damage along with the Shadow Priest and the Mage, and also incredible amounts of group survivability. But like you said, it's not the only spec that's doing that right now. Like you could make an argument that there are 5 specs at that level of brokenness in the metagame right now.
I don't think AUG is like the only thing that is super broken.
Yeah.
I will say that how they do their damage is problematic because they generally will amplify the strength of the strongest DPS specialization in the game. Currently, we'll just to be fair, we'll say it's Fire Mage. They really amplify the strengths and the powers of Fire Mage. They buff them up and then allow them to do even more damage inside of their burst windows, inside of their cooldowns and stuff like that, to the point where you're basically bringing a second copy of Fire Mage damage potentially, where the Aug Evoker then supportively is going to help defensively, like cover a lot of issues that you have. And I mean, this is due to a lot of reasons, right? Like AUG has Zephyr. They have Twin Guardian Shield. They have, just a bunch of different utility. They can take Deep Breath Stun. They can...
Yeah, I mean, all those things you just said, Devastation has as well, but AUG also has, like, Black Attunement, right? And then they have free globals to be healing in that aren't nearly as costly in terms of the damage that they're putting out.
Yes.
And they have, it's crazy as well. I mean, the Obsidian Scales Black Attunement enhancement thing is
I've seen
extremely messed up. Chrono Ward as well, the shield provided by the Breath of Ian's damage is insane. But also, I mean, they're also just contributing a huge amount of damage, right? Like they have maybe a little bit more utility than the average spec, but they're also doing more damage or bringing more damage to the group. So like, if you saw their damage get nerfed by a lot, all of a sudden we'd be talking about how the new best specs damage. We'd be talking about all the great utility that whatever that spec brought
I think that it's really easy to fall into a loop where you just list all the utility and be like, this is why they're broken. But at the same point, like Augmentation has definitely, if their damage contribution got cut by a significant amount, we would not be talking about it like this. At the same point, it is very easy for them to stay in a state where they are either broken or completely useless, and very rarely in between, because their damage contribution isn't based off of their own merits in a lot of instances, right? It's based off other people.
Yeah, the difficult part for them of like the skill-based gameplay that they do is pretty minimal, at least on doing the damage rotation. Like most of the skill of an Augmentation Evoker is good use of your utility. Maintaining good ebb and might uptime it's not nothing, but rotationally it's a lot less complex than the pure DPS. It's interesting as well because this spec, I think it does a really good job of people that want to play a support having a fun play style in M+, because it is quite simple. In Raid, you actually get this added mini game that at least the more casual Augmentation players that I've spoken to and that have talked in my stream and stuff don't actually enjoy, of like choosing your targets for Ebb and Might, because that's something you don't have to do in M+, but you do have to do in Raid. It's very strange, but I feel like it's more complex, maybe more rewarding or whatever for a super high-end player in Raid, perhaps, but most of the Augmentation Evokers I know find it a lot cozier in M+.
So just looking at the Augmentation Evoker like rotation page on Wowhead, which I think is like a pretty good resource if you're trying to like pick up the spec. Like you were saying in Raid, it's about precast and maintain prescience on 2 chosen DPS players, and you go through a couple buttons, and then it's like, hold on. Okay, so it's precast prescience on DPS player 1, precast blistering scales on the tank, precast prescience on DPS player 2, and then you're like tip the scales, and then eventually you have to press time skip, and then you refresh the prescience on those players, and that is a level of interaction that is, I would say, a bit surprising from a spec that's not necessarily supposed to be super. It's very basic, but it also can be pretty complicated if you're trying to min-max it.
Yeah, in raid is the thing. Whereas in M plus, like
Yes.
in M plus, you want to be playing around your 2 DPS's cooldowns, but you don't have that mini game of like making the prescience go on the right people, and therefore making the Evan might go on the right people because it just goes on your whole group in a 5-player
Correct.
group. So it's interesting. Again, I'm not talking about this like it's a problem. I don't know if it necessarily is. It's just a weird thing about how augmentation has worked out so far.
In addition to that, we've also had some other interesting raid stuff.
Yeah.
This has been changed-ish to the point where it's no longer.
Yes, this
really
was
doable.
a week 1 augmentation feature of infinitely, or you could stack any amount of
Yes.
Evan mites. Now you can only stack 4, which, you know, that's good because they scale kind of increasingly with each other, right? The more of them you have on somebody, the better they all start being because you've got not just primary stat, but you've also got verse and crit, and those are all multiplicative with each other.
Oh, sorry. If you didn't see, the clip is only 20 seconds long. Let me run this back again, so where you can watch Kazara die 100-0 just to this,
Yeah.
and it's like, this happens. I'm not even like super mad about this. I'm glad that they fixed this. There does call into question though, if the raid was released today, how many augmentation evokers would you see in a raid? Is that number healthy? Are we in a situation where it's similar to like Paladin, where you were restricted, like you were forced to run a certain number of augmentation evokers because that's like the optimal amount for your raid size, right? Like, is this a situation where you need to be running 2 augmentation evokers pretty much permanently and they're going to occupy those spots? Or is it a situation where this is like a spec that is replaceable?
Yeah, as of right now, I think probably the best comp, if there was a Race to World First today, would be like, maybe 4 augmentation, maybe 2, something like that.
Somewhere between 2 and 4. Okay, that's a lot.
Yeah, but if it were somewhat less powerful, I think there's a good chance you'd be able to play, 0 to however many you want. They don't bring a raid buff, right? I mean, I guess
Correct.
they bring the Blessing of the Bronze, but that raid buff doesn't really count, right? Because it's not especially, like, you could live without that. It doesn't really matter.
Okay. I think the last thing I really wanted to hit on was their damage contribution, like how it is shown in details and damage meters and inside of Warcraft logs. So Blizzard initially stated that there was going to be hook-ins. They were going to have the ability to be able to show damage contribution on third-party sites and in damage meters. And then about a week before Augmentation launched, Kalamazoo had an interview with the lead designer of Evoker, Graham Berger, and he stated that in-game damage meters like details will just attribute that damage directly to buff players, so it's a bit more difficult in-game to determine performance beyond just seeing larger bars for your allies. And the hooks are all in the advanced combat logs, and then that results in additional lines of text showing how much additional damage is due to the augmentation's buff. It's not fully accurate still. I think that this is something that will become fully accurate at some point, but this is still, like, even if you check Warcraft logs, it's not 100% attributing correct, and this is due to, a bunch of dot effects that aren't attributing appropriately in logs. There's, like, pet damage that's still not attributing 100% correctly in logs. Do we think it's okay for it to not show up correctly in damage meters? I guess that there is a question of that.
I mean, obviously it's not great, but it's not an easy problem to solve. Like there aren't really more hooks that Blizzard can add. I mean, I guess they could have a way in the combat log to identify if a crit was because of the prescience 3% crit or whatever.
Yeah.
Versus because of the native crit that somebody had, but there are effects like there are effects that scale off of crit or whatever, right? That, like, if you're a mage and you crit your fireball, you get a heating up proc. There's no way.
Where was that crit attributed from? Yeah.
There's no way you can attribute the extra damage that heating up proc is going to give you to the augmentation. It's just not possible. Like, and that's not to mention like the talent that they can take, which they don't usually, but they could. That gives cooldown reduction on a major cooldown.
Dude, people have been talking about that, actually running in that in Mythic Plus.
I think it's probably good. Yeah, I mean, again, it doesn't show up, but it's a lot of extra cast. It's like the bottom left talent of their class tree. Yeah, it's a possibility.
It's something that I think that high end players were exploring the potentially playing this just due to like how combustion and fire mage works. Like, how good is this really going to be?
Yeah, and I mean, basically anything aside from primary stat or versatility.
Yes.
Like, how are you ever going to actually get that 100% accurate on? It's not going to work. I would say stop hoping that that's going to happen. It's not possible.
I will say though that I think it is problematic that they did release the spec like this. I think that it's something that I understand why they don't really care for hook-ins, or maybe they're not like committing enough, like as much time as they realistically could have to make sure that the hook-ins were appropriately done. I think that for a spec like this, it is like, especially if it's supposed to be like a DPS, right? Like it's not replacing a healer, it's replacing DPS. I think it is problematic that you can't tell exactly how much damage it is doing.
Yeah, I mean, to me it's a downside of the spec, but I don't know. I mean, I guess it's sort of on Blizzard, but the problem is that like the hooks are never going to be. They're never going to actually work on everything, right? Like it's already possible for details to do everything. It's just like, that they don't have it all in yet with what's available, but they could do the same stuff that Warcraft Logs does, at least for the most part. There's a lot of problems with stuff like Ignite and accumulated damage or whatever, still not all being properly calculated as well on it, but it's there's a lot of work there, and most of it's from Warcraft Logs and details, not from Blizzard.
Yeah,
I don't know, and it's not fair to be mad at them for not having that instantly out on their, especially like details, project, right? Add-on project.
So Augmentation pretty much it has shaped the game in a lot of different ways. It's very polarizing right now. It's obviously incredibly strong. Looking forward to the future, I guess there's a question of, does this need a nerf? And if so, like what kind of nerf would be acceptable, right? Because I don't think that it's something that the spec doesn't need to be completely shot straight into the ground. I think that in raid it's actually pretty close to being okay.
Yeah, I'm not 100% confident that it even necessarily needs a raid nerf. Luckily, there's a passive that they could nerf to just nerf its M+ damage. Closest clutch mates, it's 40% increased effect of Ebon Might and Breath of Ians when not in a raid. So they could nerf that. They could make it just not apply to Breath of Ians because it doesn't necessarily need to apply to Breath of Ians. That's something that doesn't. I guess it maybe should also still do that, but they could nerf the coefficient on it from 40% down. Those sorts of nerfs would maybe be warranted for the spec. If they want to go and actually start attacking the utility of the spec, I mean, that would start taking away a lot of what makes the spec fun and exciting for people. But if they want to move to a world of it not being like extra special mandatory spec, it either has to do less damage than the other specs or not have more utility than the other specs. So I don't know.
It's tough. It's tough to attack the utility because generally.
Yeah.
Let's think about other classes that have historically been good in Mythic Plus. I think like Rogue is the one that comes to mind.
Rogue is an example of like this was doing 30k less than everything else, and you still brought it because it had more utility in several seasons. Yeah.
And I think that those are sacrifices that are okay for 5-mans, right? Like generally, whenever I'm looking at 5-mans, I think that those are sacrifices that are more or less like what you're kind of taking. I will say that I don't want Augmentation Evoker to be mandatory in a slot, and because I think that starts to run into a lot of issues whenever Augmentation is mandatory, because then if you have another spec that's mandatory, like right now, we're locked into where Priest and Aug are kind of mandatory in a lot of dungeons, and so then it's just like you're in a weird predicament.
And when we're talking about mandatory here, like it's worth noting, we're talking about there's different levels of mandatory
it's not
for this
like
purposes, right? Like,
but
it's pretty high though. Like this is reaching fairly far down. I think there could be a different conversation if it was like, oh yeah, top groups are mostly using augmentation, but it's not like insane. But right now it's like so good that if you're trying to push, like it's not just 29s, but like even if you're trying to get into a 20, you're gonna have 40 times easier getting into the LFG if you're an Augmentation Evoker versus if you're like an Arms Warrior or something, and that gap is too large. They could nerf Augmentation and it could still be the best spec for high key pushing, but if they nerf it so that it's not the best spec by a mile and it's only the best by a little bit, the game would be better, even if there has to be some best specs, and it's fine. It's fine if Augmentation's one of them. I think it's just
I agree with that.
Right now, it is by too much. It's by way too much.
There's always gonna be a best spec, right? Like
right.
We can't.
And that's not the problem. The problem is every single group is running Augmentation, and it's so powerful that it is bleeding down, even among groups where they like the information spread is pretty slow because of the details problems. after you do 5 keys in Augmentation Evoker, you're like, okay, hang on. Right?
Dude,
this is not normal.
Playing with an Aug Evoker, it is one of those things that you notice the pack is dying faster.
You just
feel
free chest
safer.
your key, and you're like, hang on a second. I was depleting this keystone last week. I don't understand what's different. It's just the Augmentation Evoker. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that overall, like maybe nerfing their 5-man damage. I think in raid, I would be more inclined to kind of slow roll this a bit more. But I think that's something for raid balancing definitely needs to happen. And I don't think it's just Augmentation Evoker. I think I would be lying if for Priest I would be a bit hesitant to touch Shadow, because Shadow's issues aren't the spec itself, it's Mass Dispel. But for Holy Paladin and Mage in Augmentation, I think that you could hit them a little bit and it would probably still be okay. And I mean, these are specs that Fire and Holy already got hit a bit.
Yeah, I think that nerfs are probably warranted to this entire comp for M+, but a lot of these specs are fine in raid.
It's not a lot,
don't need it for that. Yeah.
Again, I don't want this to turn into whining for nerfs, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like, the game is better when the best specs are not as much better than the second best specs, that they take over the entire front page of Raider.io. Like that does make the gameplay noticeably worse, and it's not just for the top groups, and it's not just because the community is being stupid. Like, sometimes there's just stupid community perceptions or stupid group leaders that are going to take things too far, and to some extent that's what's happening here. But also to some extent, like, this comp is just 3 key levels better than a random comp, and that is a problem. And if they make that down to just half a key level better than a random comp, then not only will it be easier to get into groups, but the game will be better.
I tend to agree, and I think that whenever we went from 15 viable specs to 5 viable specs, viable is so. It's viable.
Right, again, like it's a murky word, but it's true. Like the game is just like, if you compare to the weeks before the patch, there were a couple of comps in the top page. There were 10 different DPS specs on the front page for a while as well, which is great. Like that's really good.
Yeah, that's not normal. Like, that's not a normal season. I think that if we got to that every single season, it would be pretty chill. I think that this is quite problematic right now as it currently stands. I think Augmentation Evoker is actually a 6 spec. Would you be okay with them making more support? Would you?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that it was good to run this experiment now. Hopefully they're getting good data on if the people that actually want to main Augmentation Evoker are there and if they're really enjoying it. Anecdotally, it seems like there's a lot of that right now. I would say they should make sure that that's true, even if it's not super broken and overpowered. But then if that's true, then they should go ahead and either convert some specs or just make some new, make a support DH spec and some new support specs for other classes going into next expansion. Because if that gameplay is good and we want there to be a support spec in every group, there should be more than one support spec in the game.
Side note, I think that they actually have a lot of opportunities for really cool tier sets. I know their tier set only affects Evan Might right now, but I do think that
it's boring. It's very boring tier set.
I think their tier set could actually be super sick.
Yeah. Definitely a possibility there. I can't wait to see what they get once they actually, next tier.
Yeah. All right, cool. I think that's going to be it for us this week.
Yeah.
I'm interested.
Probably a pretty polarizing comment section here. Let us know. Join the conversation down below.
Please be respectful. Be respectful. Be respectful.
Yeah, definitely try and be nice. Try and be nice even with the people that disagree with you. Everybody just wants the game to be good.
All right.
And yeah, see you next week.
Game's good right now. GG's.